Welcome to Your Family's Health, the program that focuses on healthcare issues with unique and different modalities for taking charge of your health today. Experts talk weekly with our continuing roster of guests from around the country and right here in Nassau County to keep you up to date on the latest health issues and trends. Take care of your mind, body, and soul. Spend the next half hour with the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC, and get on the journey to better health.
Hello and welcome to Your Family's Health. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College. And today we're going to talk about eating disorders, how to look out for someone who may be suffering with one, and more about dieting in general and why most of us fail. My guest today is Dr. Nicole Avena, a research neuroscientist and a pioneer in the field of food addiction. She's also an expert in diet during pregnancy, relevant to babies, toddlers, and throughout childhood. Dr. Avena, welcome to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Welcome.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here with you.
So tell us about yourself and your career path. What made you want to become a doctor specializing in addictions and nutrition?
It's kind of interesting. I was always really interested in the brain. And when I was an undergraduate student, I was starting to think about what I might want to do for a career. And the professor who I'd been working with had suggested that maybe I look into getting a PhD in neuroscience. And at the time, it was kind of a new field. And it was something that I thought would be really interesting and had a lot of opportunities. And so I ended up going to Princeton University to get my PhD in neuroscience and psychology. And there I really just got interested in how the brain affected our behavior and in particular addiction. And at that time, we were starting to hear a lot more about the obesity epidemic. And it really just became interesting to me to kind of think about, well, maybe there's something about obesity and overeating and maybe just eating disorders in general that is linked to the types of foods that we're eating. And I'm wondering if maybe they could be affecting the brain in ways that can cause an addiction like drugs and alcohol can. And so that's what kind of led me down the path that I was on to really just better understand what's happening in the brain and how food plays a role in our eating behavior.
Very relevant topic. So what is an eating disorder? Could you define that for us and the different types of eating disorders?
Yeah, there are a lot of different types of eating disorders, and it's really an evolving field. And as we learn more and more about the brain and about psychology, we see that there are changes in terms of, how we identify different types of eating disorders and how they're diagnosed. And so generally, when we think about how we would define an eating disorder, it's essentially any type of disordered eating behavior that can have a negative impact on someone's psychological health or their physical health. And so we can look at eating disorders that involve individuals who may develop body weight changes that are unhealthy. For example, people who develop anorexia nervosa may end up becoming severely underweight and malnourished. And this can be detrimental to their health and eventually lead to death if not properly treated. And also overeating. In many cases, when individuals are struggling with binge eating disorder or overeating behaviors, they may develop an excess body weight that can also be unhealthy and can cause comorbid medical conditions to arise. Now, there's also this middle area where there are no effects on body weight. Many people who struggle with eating disorders often are normal weight. And so they have differences in terms of the behaviors that they're exhibiting that are causing them psychological or physical harm, but it's not necessarily as a result of changes in their body weight. And so individuals who experience binge eating disorder, for example, often are not overweight. They're often normal weight individuals. And so we can't always look at a person's size as an indication of whether or not they have an eating disorder or may have an eating disorder. It really has to be properly evaluated by a clinician to determine whether or not the behaviors the person is engaging in are causing them physical harm.
So being a neuroscientist, what have you found to be the underlying issue with the brain that might cause a food addiction?
We've studied this for quite some time now. We actually started studying this in laboratory rats many, many years ago, because as neuroscientists, we were very interested in trying to figure out, what was it specifically in the brain that was being altered by overeating food, by a food addiction. And so what we ended up really discovering is that there are alterations in the brain's reward system that occur when our laboratory rats or people overeat highly palatable foods, foods that are rich in added sugars, foods that are highly processed foods, like the type of foods we typically see in the grocery store that are really commonplace nowadays in our society. And what ends up happening is the brain's reward system changes and people come to release dopamine and other neurochemicals in a way that looks just like what would happen if someone was using a drug of abuse. And so we see this repeated release of dopamine in response to eating these types of foods. And that contributes to what ends up for many people becoming an addiction. And that's why so many people find it difficult to cut back on processed foods and to eat healthy and to avoid fast foods, because we know that these foods are overactivating our brain reward system and really setting people up for a struggle to maintain healthy eating patterns.
So what foods fall into the reward system? I know you just mentioned sugar. Are there any other kinds of foods that the brain would see as being a desire to overeat or binge on outside of sugar?
It's a great question. So we started off looking at sugar many years ago, in part because that had been identified as a ingredient that was particularly problematic for many individuals who were dieting. Many people who were trying to lose weight or trying to eat healthy would report that they found it difficult to control their intake of things that contained a lot of added sugar, like cakes and cookies and things like that. And also at the time, we had started to see from epidemiological studies that there was an interesting correlation between the increase in the amount of sugar that Americans were consuming and the rise in the obesity rates. And so it seemed like there might be a relationship between sugar and obesity that we hadn't quite yet understood. And so we started off looking at sugar in part as well, because so many of the foods that we eat contain added sugar. If you go to the grocery store, I challenge you to try to fill your cart with foods that don't have any added sugar, because it's very difficult to identify them. Most of the foods that are processed foods that are shelf stable contain added sugar. And so it's something that many people are eating a lot of and don't even realize it. And we've gone beyond looking at sugar. We actually published a study a few years back where we were interested in cataloging all of the different foods that could potentially be addictive. And interestingly, what we found was that the foods that were the most highly processed, irrespective of whether or not they contained added sugar, were the ones that were identified as being addictive in our research study. And so even things that didn't contain added sugar but were processed, like pizza, for example, that was one that stood out as being highly addictive. Cheese is also something that stood out as being addictive. And so the bottom line in terms of whether or not something is addictive with respect to a food seems to come from the fact of if it's highly processed or not. The more highly processed the foods are, the more likely they seem to be addictive.
So what about salt and fat? Is that a food that you have isolated to be also an addictive component in our diet?
It's a great question. We've not specifically looked at salt, but much like sugar, salt is an ingredient that is added to so many of the foods that we consume these days. This is particularly an issue for people who dine out in restaurants quite often. There's often a lot of salt added to foods in restaurants and fast food restaurants in particular. And so the salt component is meant to be a flavor enhancer, but what ends up happening for many individuals is that they become so accustomed to the taste of the salt that when they don't have it on their food, they think it's bland and boring and they continue to add salt. And so this does seem to be an ingredient that people crave and that people are interested in having more of. And it has a serious side effect of the fact that too much added salt in our diet can have a negative impact on our cardiovascular health. And so we really should be working to try to minimize our intake of salt. But most of us are actually consuming more of it than we even realize just because it's included in so many foods. And the same with fat. Fat's a little bit more complicated because, we need fat to survive. Our brains actually thrive on fat, but it has to be good, healthy sources of fat. And so we find that if you take a look at the different types of fats that are out there, obviously people want to avoid trans fats and saturated fats, but we really want to try to make sure we're getting healthy fats like omega-3 fatty acids and omega-6 fatty acids. These are the types of fats that you'd find in, fish or avocados. Our brain needs fat because our neurons communicate by having an installation of fat in between them. And so we do need to make sure that we are getting some healthy fats in our diet in order for us to have good brain health.
So when you talk about sugar and highly processed foods, what do these ingredients do to our brain that makes us want more of them?
Well, what ends up happening is that when we eat food normally, we release dopamine the very first time we eat a new food, dopamine in our reward-related brain areas. And this is because dopamine is associated with paying attention. So the very first time you eat a new food, you want to make sure you're paying attention because we evolved to make sure that we don't eat foods that are going to make us sick, right? Because if we did, it could kill us. And so we pay attention when we have a new taste. This is why kids are often picky eaters, because a lot of times they're, neophobic. They're naturally kind of leery of new tastes, and that has an evolutionary advantage to it. And so the very first time we eat a new food, we pay attention and our brains will release dopamine. But normally, after we've consumed food a few times and had that taste, our brain doesn't release dopamine in response to it. But what's interesting is drugs of abuse act very differently. Every time a drug of abuse is administered, whether it's nicotine, morphine, cocaine, alcohol, it releases dopamine in these reward-related brain regions. And so one of the key studies that we conducted in my laboratory was to ask, well, what happens if we give highly palatable foods? Will that release dopamine in a way that looks like a food, or will that release dopamine in a way that looks like a drug? And what we found was that, in fact, when highly palatable, high sugar foods are consumed, it causes the brain to release dopamine every single time, just like what happens with a drug of abuse. And so this in part can explain why it's so difficult for people to cut back on those sweet treats and the cakes and the cookies, because they're releasing dopamine every single time. Just like when someone smokes a cigarette or drinks alcohol, it produces this cascade of reward that is changing our brain. And that can lead to withdrawal when we no longer have the substance available. That can lead to craving. It can also lead to tolerance, where people would be satisfied by having maybe one cookie. But now if they've been consuming them regularly, now they need 3 or 4 or 5 maybe to feel that type of satisfaction. And so as a result of overeating these highly palatable, high sugar foods, our brains essentially change, and they come to look more like what would happen when we see somebody who's dependent on drugs than someone who's typically just eating a healthy diet.
Fascinating. You're listening to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard, and today we're learning about eating disorders, how to look out for someone who may be suffering with one, and more about dieting in general, and why most of us fail them. My guest today is Dr. Nicole Avena, a research neuroscientist and pioneer in the food addictive area. She is also an expert in diet during pregnancy, for babies, for toddlers, and throughout childhood. So I would ask you another question, Doctor. Now, I'm wondering, do fast food establishments understand this phenomenon about the addictive properties in food and highly sugary foods? I wonder, do they understand this phenomenon?
It's a great question. And I would imagine that they probably do. I think that when we take a look at the type of foods that are offered at these establishments, they typically are very highly palatable, will contain excess amounts of the things that we've been talking about, like sugar and salt and saturated fat. And yeah, certainly there are a handful of healthy options that are typically available at some of these places, but those aren't really the featured food products. I think many of the fast food establishments that are common these days are reliant on the fact that people get pleasure from eating at those types of establishments, and they seek out those types of foods because they make them feel good. Yeah. And it's often the case that, people will take their kids to places like that as a reward if they do well at school or, if they behave. And so we've created this relationship among fast food eating and pleasure seeking, where people use it as a way to reward themselves. And I think that the fast food industry is aware of that. And I think that they're capitalizing on it. Yeah. And as a result, our children and ourselves are suffering in terms of our health.
Very true. What are the warning signs to look out for if I think someone in my life, a friend or family member, may be suffering from an eating disorder? What do I look for?
Well, there's a lot of different symptoms that can be associated with an eating disorder. And so it can be difficult to identify someone as having an eating disorder just, simply by thinking about their behaviors or interacting with them. If you're suspicious that a loved one or a friend or a family member might be struggling with their eating behaviors, it's really important that they speak to a professional, speak to a medical doctor, speak to a counselor so that they can get properly evaluated. I think that, it's difficult in our society these days because there are so many different types of dietary patterns that people follow. There's a lot of popularity among different types of, eating patterns. Like, for example, intermittent fasting is quite popular right now, and it's viewed as something that's acceptable for people to engage in. However, it could certainly be the case that someone who might be struggling with, binge eating disorder or bulimia nervosa could be able to explain away the fact why they're not eating dinner and say, oh, it's because I'm intermittent fasting. And so, I think that we need to be mindful of the fact that while it's certainly, appropriate and acceptable for people to have a variety of different types of dietary patterns that they engage in, sometimes those are not healthy. And sometimes individuals who could be at risk for developing an eating disorder might find that, following one of these types of restrictive eating patterns can actually put them at greater risk. And so I think it's important, especially for parents, to be aware of that because it's something that we should know about when we're talking with our children about healthy eating.
So when we're talking, just switching gears here about treating someone that may be suffering from an eating disorder, as a parent, when I'm thinking about my child, would it be safe to say that a part of my treating or handling a child that may become addicted to sugar is to not give them sugar at all?
That's a great question. And, I'm a parent as well. And so I can speak from both professional experience and personal experience. And my take on it is that, especially when we're coming at this through the lens of a potential eating disorder, is that we really have to be mindful of severely restricting certain types of foods. Now, I know that we want to try to minimize our exposure to sugar and it's important for our health, but I don't advise telling young children and telling anyone for that matter that they shouldn't have any sugar at all. I think that the goal should be to have room in our diet and have the control over our behaviors so that if we feel like having a piece of cake at someone's birthday, then it's acceptable and okay to do that. And I think as a parent, I can speak from experience with what I've, done, my husband and I have done with our children, is that we want to teach them healthy amounts of these types of foods so that when they're off on their own, they can make good decisions. We're not always going to be there for them to, help them to make decisions about what they should or shouldn't eat. And so I think it's important that we teach our children to be able to police themselves. And so if they go to school and it's Susie's birthday and her mom brought in cupcakes, then that's great. We had a cupcake, but that means that we're not having dessert at dinner tonight because we already had dessert during school. And I think the same, goes for older children, it's really about helping them to understand that it's not about your looks or whether or not you should or shouldn't have something. It's really about making the healthiest decision and thinking about what's going to be best for your body in both the short term and also in the long term.
Do you offer or recommend any kind of behavioral modifications to handle or deal with some of these eating disorders? And what type of behavioral modifications or medications, if you will?
Well, I think, my take on things as a neuroscientist and psychologist is really about the ways in which we can help people change their behaviors. Now, certainly there are cases in which individuals require medications, and that's something that a psychiatrist or medical doctor can certainly help with, and family doctors can certainly help with. But my approach has really been to work on behavioral modifications and really taking what's known as a harm reduction approach. Now, typically when people think about addiction, especially if it comes to things like drugs and alcohol, they think that you need to completely abstain from the things that you're addicted to. And in many cases, that is absolutely true. But it's a little bit difficult with food to apply this abstinence model because we need food to survive. And you can't abstain from all foods. I mean, yes, you can certainly abstain from some foods, but it's really difficult because there's lots of shades of gray in terms of, well, what is a healthy food? What's an unhealthy food? And it can be difficult for people to make that determination. So I really think that a harm reduction model is appropriate when it comes to talking about food addiction. And what a harm reduction model is it's essentially like the title suggests. It's a way in which we can reduce the harm. So if somebody is drinking, let's just say, a gallon of soda every day, we want to reduce that harm because that's causing that person a significant amount of harm. So we want to help them to maybe drink half a gallon eventually, and then get it down to, maybe just 1 can a day. And then eventually, hopefully get them off of drinking soda and maybe drinking water instead. And basically incrementally working with a person to help them identify these sources of unhealthy foods, of added sugars in their diet, and slowly implementing changes to reduce them as much as we possibly can and replacing them with healthier alternatives. And from a psychological standpoint, it seems to be something that many people are able to resonate well with, because when we tell people, you have to abstain completely from cookies, you can never have them again, it can be very, very disheartening, and people are often not motivated to engage in something like that because they feel that it's going to be too difficult for them. But if we approach this as, look, we're trying to reduce the harm that you're causing yourself by eating all these unhealthy foods, let's take a step-by-step approach to reduce them, it becomes more manageable and more reasonable for people, and people can get behind that idea, I think, a lot more readily than they can if they're told you can never have those foods again.
So I'm thinking about becoming addictive and addictive behaviors, similar to, as you mentioned earlier, drugs. And when these cravings occur, sometimes they're kind of unwieldy. And so maybe to suggest for you to modify your own behavior is maybe a lot to ask for someone who is really craving, this crave of addiction for foods. How do we intervene in ways that doesn't seem so dramatic, where we're actually taking the food? Because sometimes it gets that way when you're desperate for that person's behavior to change. What can we do that becomes palatable to that person that may be addicted to food?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, there's going to be degrees of how addicted someone might be to food. And there's going to be severe cases where, people may need to have a more structured approach where they are in a facility where they're able to get treatment and get, one-on-one counseling so that they can get some more precise help with the issues that they're struggling with. But if you have someone in your family or in your household that really just needs that extra support, I think it's important to make sure that we're providing an environment that is going to be conducive to them getting better. Often that might mean that the entire family gets on board with changing their eating habits. It can be very difficult for people, and I've worked with people over the years who've struggled with this. If the family dynamic is such that, maybe the mom wants to, cut back on the sweets and needs help with, reducing her sugar intake. And she's trying very hard to do that. But dad and the kids aren't on board with that. And they still want to have, all of these sweet treats in the house. That's creating an environment that's going to make it very difficult for the individual who's trying to reduce their food intake and reduce their palatable food intake to be able to be successful. And so I think, people who are really struggling often do need to have some additional environmental support where these types of foods are just not brought into the home. Mm-hmm. And so that people can have, better chances of success, and it's less of a temptation, less of a craving if they don't see those foods staring at them in the pantry or the refrigerator. Mm-hmm. I think too, having that ability to help people to find a way to distract themselves through the cravings. This is something that I talk a lot about in my book, Why Diets Fail. It's difficult for people who are craving things, but those cravings are fleeting. The cravings aren't going to last forever. And what really can change a craving is if you can interfere with it and to basically just disrupt it. And if you don't give into a craving, those cravings over time are going to get weaker and weaker because you're loosening the association between the food that you're craving and the reward that you're going to get from dopamine being released when you eat it. And so that's the key to helping people overcome cravings, is to distract them, help them find something else to do, and having support around the house and having friends and family that people can lean on when they are experiencing cravings. It can really make a big difference, and it can help people to succeed in ways that they wouldn't be able to do on their own.
So you have written a book, and your latest book is Why Diets Fail, and because you're addicted to sugar. But then there's another book that you wrote that I really like, is What to Eat When You're Pregnant. And obviously you're eating for two. But what is the one tip that you would say for those that are pregnant or anticipating getting pregnant? When it comes to nutrition, and how should you modify your diet?
My advice for people who are pregnant, when you're trying to decide what food you should eat, it's really about having a variety of foods and really trying to minimize those added sugars. There's been so many studies that have come out over the past 10 years that show that babies who are exposed to sugar in utero, in the womb, end up having changes in gene expression, changes in the way in which they have preferences for foods later on. And it can really have a negative impact on health outcomes when babies are exposed to too much excess processed foods in utero. And so focusing on eating wholesome, healthy foods, getting a variety of foods, eat the rainbow, eat a variety of different colored fruits and vegetables. It can really be a great way to support your pregnancy and also support the health outcomes for your baby later on.
Where can people find information about you and get more information?
You can find more about me at my website. It's drnicoleavena.com. And I'm also on social media at Dr. Nicole Avena. Definitely check out my books, What to Eat When You're Pregnant, and also What to Feed Your Baby and Toddler.
Well, thank you for being here, Dr. Nicole Avena, a research neuroscientist and a pioneer in the field of food addiction. We hope you stay safe and continue to stay healthy. And thank you for being our guest today.
Oh, thanks so much.
This is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College, and we want to thank you for listening to this week's edition of Your Family's Health.
We'd like to get your feedback on your family's health. Send your comments by emailing them to whpc@ncc.edu. Podcasts of today's show are available on iTunes, Android Podcasts, and Spreaker. This program was produced at the studios of Nassau Community College in cooperation with the nursing department. Join us next week for another edition of Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.